All right, well, good afternoon, everyone. I want to thank you for being here today. And it's, again, as Heist said, we'll talk for about 45 minutes, take a break, talk for about another 45 minutes. But then after the second talk, we are available all evening. We can talk about other topics. We can, questions. So I want to make sure everyone has plenty of time to ask questions. Never like to give a talk like this and have someone leave saying, I wonder why they didn't talk about this, or I wish they had talked about that. So again, but in respect for people's time and just we'll try to get through a lot in those two 45-minute sessions. I also try to keep this try to explain things, I guess, as best as possible, and I'm not necessarily good at that, but any of the kids, youth that would like to stay for the whole time, they're totally welcome to also. Because I think everyone in here, I think, could possibly follow as well. But if it gets kind of like, there's going to be some really good kids activities too. So also feel free to send me an email anytime. If again, if you have a question you think of, next week, next month, feel free to always send me an email. And there's a material on the back table that's going to be left here in the congregation's library. So during the break or after the session, feel free to look at that material just so you'll know what's available, which also has a lot of additional information. And then there's some other good organizations. Sometimes I work a lot with Apologetics Press, and they're an excellent group. And so they're apologeticspress.org. So title the talk, it's Science and Worldview. And so I thought it was important to start out with a definition of science. And when I was growing up, I was always very interested in science, very interested in engineering. One of the reasons I like to talk about this, give this type of presentation, is I was completely outside of the church, and so it's amazing the spin that people will put on science, especially outside of the church, because we realize that true science, I like to say true science is catching up with the Bible. In other words, what we'll think is something that was scientific, if it's against the Bible, if you wait, sometimes it takes decades, but you wait time, it will catch up with the Bible. So I wasn't, Julie and I my wife and I, we were both baptized when we were 36 years old. So we went through a lot of life, just kind of, I'll just say almost a confused state. And I don't know how else to describe it, but outside of the church, outside of a belief in God, there's a lot of things that just, they don't make sense, but you don't know why they don't make sense. And so I just say that's kind of a confused state of existence. And so I'd like to start out, definition of science, systematic study of the structure and behavior of the physical and natural world through observation, experimentation, and the testing of theories against the evidence obtained. And that's actually, that's a Google definition. That's, I think, the best one available on the internet, because some of the ones on the internet were just like, science is any philosophy that denies God. It's basically what they were saying. It's like, well, that's not really science, but that's, to me, that's a good definition of science. So that's kind of how we're going to be approaching things. And then one other thing we'll be talking about is the falsification principle, because this is very important to science, because if you make a theory, but it's, hey, Heist, we think we're having some possible technical difficulties.
Let me ask you to take just a pause. We forgot to ask people who are listening in Dutch to have a page with.
Oh yes, okay, sounds good. All right.
Wie heeft is met een vertaling in Nederlands bezig? Dan heb je ook een blad. Kees, was de bedoeling ook om die in Engels uit te delen aan de mensen of niet? Nog niet?
Doe maar aan het einde.
Ja, oké. Als je deze kan je wel kunnen gebruiken als je met Nederlands bezig bent.
And did everyone get a handout in general?
We will.
Scott, will you get the other ones in English?
The English we will.
You want to do that later?
Okay, and I have a copy there if you need to make copies.
Oké, wie heeft een Nederlandse notitieblad nodig? Zeg maar je hand op, of kan je dat doorgeven alsjeblieft? Aan Richard. Nederlands.
Je hebt een, oké, goed, je bent toevoorzien.
Rest. Nog iemand? Ja, twee. Dat is te veel. Ja, hij maakt ook niet voor zijn scherm. En they say something. Mike, if you can also just speak a little bit louder on this side of the.
Oh, okay, sure.
this side
Okay.
of the room. Then we'll get.
Okay, can everyone hear me pretty good now? Okay, so I won't start over. So that's the good news. But okay, so continuing on, so we talked about science and what science is, and then also scientific theory. One of the ideas is that it has to be falsifiable, and so that's something we'll talk about later in the talk. But for something to really be a scientific theory, what they're really saying is there has to be an experiment that could be done to show that theory was false. And so, so I can say, like, I think gravity pulls towards the center of the Earth, and I can keep testing it by just dropping my little remote here, and boy, every time it looks like gravity's pulling towards the center of the Earth. If just once my remote goes up, then I either need to come with a really good explanation for why it went up, or I realize that, okay, maybe my theory was wrong. So it is falsifiable. Now, where that's going to come into play is when we talk about the Big Bang Theory, it is constructed to not be falsifiable. In other words, no matter what observation we make, the way that theory or that idea has been constructed is so you could never prove it wrong. And what they do is they add what they call adjustable parameters. And so we'll show that, but it's really important because some people will say, something is a scientific theory or it's science, and if you look at it, it's really not even science. In other words, like the Big Bang, technically it's not even a scientific theory, even though some people will say, oh no, it's proven. Well, it can't be proven because no matter what we observe, you can adjust it so that it wasn't falsified. So that's important. We'll talk about that later in the talk. The other one I want to start out with is this is an idea that's really important, but you could say that it's not necessarily science. But the importance of this is when we start talking, this type of discussion, we really have to admit that we are there's more than just things that can be described scientifically. And so that could be a whole nother discussion, but I'd like to just use this example. And so this is the idea that we can make choices. And so everyone chose to be here today, and I'm really glad you chose to be here. You kind of chose where to sit, you chose whether to get coffee or refreshments, or in the break. So if you think about it, you've made thousands of choices today. But if you were just a chemical reaction, in other words, if you were just several thousand trillion atoms chemically reacting, you could not make a choice. And so I want to elaborate that on a little bit. Do you guys have, do you do campfires and bonfires? Yeah, okay, yeah. So it's real popular in the United States too, especially winter, and you just, or fall, and it's really relaxing. You go out and kind of just out in nature and you have a campfire or just anywhere. And so that's what those pictures on the left are. But I want you to actually look at the fire instead of the family enjoying the fire. Okay, and so the reason to look at the fire is a piece of wood burning in a fire is actually a very sophisticated chemical reaction because it depends on the composition of the wood, the texture of the wood, temperature of the wood, the temperature of the air, the velocity of the air going by the wood. So many factors, and in fact, it's so complicated that we can take our best laboratories, measure that composition, measure the texture, do every piece of measurement we can on that wood, and we can take our best computational fluid dynamics programs, just basically the best computer programs. We cannot predict how a piece of wood is going to burn when we put it in a fire. So it's a very complicated chemical reaction to the point we can't even predict it. But even though it's a very complicated chemical reaction, can the wood choose where it's going to burn? And what I mean is, like, have you ever been at a bonfire and the person next to you says, I'm so glad the wood chose to burn that way. That's just beautiful. You're like, man, they're getting too cold. We need to get them inside. You'd be worried about them, right? But, and the reason the wood can't choose, even though it's a complicated chemical reaction, That's all it is. If God had not given us a soul, we would be the same way. We would be this very complicated, incredibly complicated chemical reaction, but we could not make a single choice. And so we all know that we make choices, and so that right there, I like to say it just makes it almost easier to think objectively about what we see around us. Think, as a Christian, I'll say think objectively about God's creation, but just at least think objectively, because now we're not having to constrain our thinking to ruling out God. And outside of the church, if you get into some very atheistic communities, they are really constraining their thinking by not being able to consider God, and to the point where they're having to ignore evidence where the evidence is clearly pointing in a direction that they fear might lead a person to God, but they're not allowed to follow the evidence. They're not allowed to follow the science because it violates their philosophy. It violates atheism. And so I like to get this one out front, because again, okay, we know, if we have a soul, we can make choices, we have a soul, only God can give us a soul. And so it kind of allows us to think more objectively about everything else. Now I will say also though, there are some people, they are such devout atheists, there are whole books written now about how, well, we really don't have free will. You really can't make a choice. And there's one out there now, I'm trying to get through it, it's like a 500-page book about how exciting life is because I can't make a choice. And I'm still struggling with that one, because if I'm just a chemical reaction, then I can never ask a piece of wood if it's having an exciting life, but I don't think it's gonna, because it can't make choices either. But so it's kind of strange. So you'll run into that. Okay, so that's kind of the first point. Any questions? Is that kind of clear to everybody? Okay, so the fact we can make choices proves we have a soul. Only God can give us a soul. So a lot of ways you can use this if you're evangelizing, because that's the other thing. I like to make these talks just kind of useful, not just abstract. So if you're talking to someone, you say, hey, would you like to study the Bible with me? And they say, oh, I'm an atheist. And you say, oh, did you choose to be an atheist? And they say, yes, I chose to be an atheist. Then however you can do it politely, speaking the truth in love, you say, well, if atheism was right, you could not choose to be an atheist, right? Because atheism says you don't have a soul. So if they were right, no one could choose to be an atheist. That would have just been, they'd just be that piece of wood. They were just, their chemical reactions made them be an atheist, which most people, at some point, they're going to say, oh, that doesn't make sense. Okay, so that's kind of the use of that. And then, again, I'll try to stop, but if you think about some more and want to talk more at the break or after, the second talk, we'll definitely do that. Okay, so that was the first point on the handout. Now the second one, okay, so we're trying to talk to people, and it is so easy to get in a fight on this topic. They talk about, like in the United States, they'll say things like, families will get together at, say family gets together at Christmas or Thanksgiving, some of our holidays, and they'll say, okay, if you get your family together, there's two things you don't talk about. You don't talk about religion, and you don't talk about politics. Okay, do you ever notice that? So religion and politics are two things really easy to get in a fight over. So if you want to just have a nice family dinner, and you only see each other once a year, don't talk about politics, don't talk about religion. Okay, so, but one way you can talk about almost anything is ask questions. So you say you get really adventurous and you want to talk politics. Well, you just ask someone, well, what do you think about, or this guy, or that, And so with this topic, you can actually kind of do the same, because the second point is that, the simplest life, and of course, the Bible tells us that God created all life, but a second point we can cover scientifically is just, okay, let's look at life. Let's look at a bacteria. Let's look at the simplest life you could imagine. Okay, what does, what can we learn about that from science? Well, several hundred years ago, people used to think, well, maybe life just makes itself. I mean, we have some great refreshments out on the counter there. Suppose we just let those sit for a couple months. Okay, so you just let them sit out on the counter. Well, there's a good chance there's going to be some life growing on top. Okay, and so people in the Middle Ages, they used to think, well, maybe meat would give rise to maggots, or maybe bread would give rise to mold, or maybe fruit, you could have fruit flies from the fruit. So you have all these ideas about where life comes from. Well, Louis Pasteur, of course, did experiments to show that no, life only comes from life. And then the more we've learned from true science, as true science has advanced, we now know that the simplest life is vastly more complicated than anything people have ever made. It's more like a bacteria is more complicated than this computer or a car or a rocket. And we know that from true science. Now, there's excellent books on the table. It's called Stairway to Life. And again, the congregation here will have the copies of that, but feel free, if you'd like your own copy, we can definitely just send some over, or they can get some. But so how do you broach that with a person? Well, one of the ways you can do that is just ask a question. And so one way to maybe phrase that question, and I think I don't have it written down here, but you can just say something like, do you think it's scientific to believe that something happened, and in this case it would be life arising from non-living material, that we've been unable to duplicate given hundreds of billions of dollars in biotechnology, or smartest PhDs, or best laboratories? So if you ask the question that way, is it scientific? Or then I've asked that at work before. I've never once had a person say they thought it was scientific. And what's interesting, I've had people say, well, it's not scientific, but it's still what I believe. But they'll just say that, and it's not we're not in a fight, we're not in an argument. To me, that's actually a very open statement. Now, it's also very, you think, well, that wasn't too helpful, that wasn't too useful. It's actually very useful, because a lot of atheists are deceived into thinking atheism is somehow scientific. And so if you point out, well, atheism requires that life would just make itself, and then you just ask them, is that really scientific given what we know about life? And they say, well, no, it's not scientific, but I still believe it. Well, that's actually huge, because now they're admitting that atheism in general, it goes against a lot, pretty much everything we know about from science. But they're admitting that, they're hearing themselves admit that, and so that's again just a way to possibly phrase a question. We can talk a lot more about life, but again, excellent resources there. Any questions on that? Is that? And again, just think about how you would use it, because right now you have, so far most people will agree they have free will. I'd say everybody, but every now and then you'll find someone that's so committed to atheism that they'll say, no, I don't have free will. And then you're like, well, why are you talking to me? Well, that's just their chemicals. I mean, it's, and then, but then the second one is just, okay, could life make itself? And we know it can't. We've really known it can't since the 1860s, but boy, now it's just, life is so incredibly complicated. So those are two. Now, we'll talk later when we talk about where the universe come from. A lot of times there's mathematical tricks that can be played with infinity, but then that, using those tricks with infinity still doesn't give us free will. So you can really, I shouldn't say that, you can make the airtight case that for God, but that doesn't help the person. You still want, obviously the ultimate goal is to get them into God's Word, to get them studying their Bible, to get them to really consider the truth, obey the gospel. But it's it's from what we know from true science now, it's a very I'll call it just an airtight discussion. Okay, so the third one is related to genetic information. Now the resource on that, it's a lot of resources out there that are available. There's a book called Genetic Information, or Genetic Entropy, and so that's on the table over there. And so it's very, again, an excellent resource. And it's it was basically a former evolutionist, but he was a PhD geneticist, and he actually co-developed what they call the gene gun. Okay, so that was the technology that's used for like genetically modified organisms, for genetic engineering. That was the first technology used. There's some other technologies used now. So he's leading in his field. Well, he wrote a book because he said, no, what we're seeing in the genome from our study of DNA, it's exactly the opposite of evolution. And so we'll spend a few slides on this because this is a really important point. Because when you think about life, okay, so we mentioned the bacteria. We know a bacteria can't make itself, but a bacteria still has a tremendous amount of genetic information. So and genetic information, what I mean by that, it's just that DNA is a very sophisticated molecule that God uses to, I'd say, code for the physical basically the physical characteristics of all organisms. So a bacteria has DNA, we have DNA, a mouse has DNA, a plant has DNA, and that codes for the physical characteristics. My DNA, 2 arms, 2 legs, a head, blue eyes, that's all my DNA. But people have different DNA, but also just all of life has DNA in it. And so, so where did that information come from? Well, if we are looking in the Bible, of course, Genesis 1 and 2 gives a creation account, and the idea would be, okay, during the original creation, God put a tremendous amount of genetic information in the original created kinds. And so that would be all the physical characteristics of all the life that we see around us. Well, that's what we're seeing from the genome. You have this tremendous amount of genetic information, and then you have changes in physical characteristics based on that pre-existing genetic information. And so you would have, I guess you would say, like population densities or differences. It can be mutations, natural selection, but it's all based on that existing information. And of course, the only other alternative is somehow that information created itself, and that's what we don't see. When we're studying the genome, we're not seeing this new genetic information being created. And so, so I'll give an example. This is just kind of what I just said. So I'll start out with an example. And so I'm just curious. I was blessed to be in Uruguay a couple weeks ago, and they actually use this example in their biology textbook. Has anyone seen the peppered moths example for evolution? Okay, so good. We got some here too. And then now it's some of the textbooks are switching to what they call Darwin's finches, but it's the same exact idea. And basically, these are presented as evidence for evolution. They have nothing to do with evolution. And so I'll just explain why. All this is just natural selection changing a population density. The reason it has nothing to do with evolution is there's no new genetic information created. So we mentioned how a bacteria has genetic information. Well, how would you create all of the additional genetic information needed to turn that bacteria into a person? Okay, so you have to create genetic information. None of the examples in any textbooks or in any museums have anything to show a new genetic information being created. It's always existing genetic information, or a lot of times it's a loss of genetic information. Okay, so hang with me for about 2 or 3 minutes, and this will hopefully start making a little more sense. But okay, so I'll give the example of the peppered moth. So the idea is about 1850. I think England is given credit for where they studied this. There were 2 types of moths. You have the typica form on the left and the carbonaria form on the right. And something like 98% of the moths were said to be that typica form. And the reason was the trees around the cities, they had a kind of a light colored bark with some dark markings on it. And I noticed those driving here yesterday. The trees that looked really exactly the way they were described. In the United States, we call them birch trees in some parts, aspen trees in other parts, but I'm not sure what the name is here. But it's kind of like a whitish bark with some dark coloration on it. Well, you can imagine that moth on the left, it could blend in pretty well. It'd be very well camouflaged. The moth on the right, boy, that'd be easy to spot. A bird would notice, hey, whenever I see that dark triangle, that's a good thing to eat. Okay, so that was the explanation given for why 98% of the moths were the one on the left, 2 were like the coloration of the one on the right. Now, what you had then was the Industrial Revolution, and apparently, kind of once the Industrial Revolution got into kind of full gear, the air got really polluted, and it got so polluted that the bark on the trees actually became darker. And again, this is just how it's presented. So now the population density flipped, and so you now had most of the moths where like the color on the right, the carbonariiform, and so, but you think, boy, those blend in really well if the tree bark is very dark. And then the one on the left, okay, it's got this light coloration. Well, now it's easy to spot, right? Because the bird's going to see that white moth and know that, hey, that's something good to eat. And so it flipped back. So now it's only 2% of the typical form, 98% of the carbonariiform. About 1950, put scrubbers on smokestacks, the air got cleaned up, and the tree bark became its natural color again, population density flipped back again. And so there's at least one textbook in the United States that says, wow, this is evolution in action. What else do we need, to prove evolution? But do you see how it has nothing to do with evolution? Because the genetic information was always there. There was always the genetic information for the moth on the left. There was always the genetic information for the moth on the right. And just based on the selection pressure, that density could flip back and forth. Okay? Okay, so I'll give one more example, then I'll stop and we'll have some discussion. Because this is another important one. Have anyone heard that bacteria are developing resistance to antibiotics? Okay, so that's that, then they are, and that's a big problem. So true science, again, we have to apply true science to solve big problems. So if you look at true science of what's happening, they are developing the resistance, but it has nothing to do with evolution. And the one that people sometimes say, oh, well, bacteria are evolving resistance to antibiotics, and that's probably an okay use as long as people know the use of the word evolve in that case has nothing to do with this idea of life somehow turn other kinds of life. I don't like it because I think they purposely try to smear it. So bacteria developing resistance, nothing to do with evolution. Okay, so this is the reason why, or an explanation. If I say a bacteria infects me and I take an antibiotic and it kills 999 out of 1,000 of the bacteria, well, that's a good antibiotic. But if that 1 out of 1,000 is resistant to the antibiotic and it recolonizes my body, I'm now infected by an antibiotic-resistant strain of bacteria. Okay, nothing to do with evolution because the information to resist the antibiotic was always there. In other words, no new information created. The second way is there are some bacteria, most bacteria are actually good for us. So we've known about the bacteria in our digestive system for many years now, and they actually help with our digestion. I'll call it a gross side fact, is there's actually more bacteria in our body than there are human cells because it's a symbiotic relationship. But some of those good bacteria, they're resistant to our antibiotics. Okay, so that's great. You want them to resist the antibiotics. But if a good bacteria comes in close proximity to a harmful bacteria, you can actually have what's called a plasmid transfer, where the good bacteria will transfer a bit of genetic information, like a little loop of DNA, to the bad bacteria, making the bad bacteria resistant to the antibiotics. Okay, but it's still nothing, and actually hospitals are having to do certain protocols to try to keep that from happening. But still, the information to resist the antibiotic was always in the genome. Okay, so nothing to do with evolution. Now the third way, and this may be the way that most bacteria are becoming resistant to antibiotics now, is actually the opposite of evolution. So what I mean by that is, you remember the story about the Trojan horse? And there's this war in ancient Greece, and they had this one city, they made this just beautiful wooden horse apparently, and the other city thought it was a gift, but the city that was attacking, they'd actually had a bunch of soldiers hiding in the horse, and so the city that thought it was a gift, they took it into the city, the soldiers came out, they took over the city. So that's basically how a lot of our modern antibiotics work. We try to disguise the antibiotic so it looks like a nutrient to the bacteria, and so the bacteria, when it's absorbing this nutrient, it's actually a poison. So it absorbs this nutrient, and it's really an antibiotic that kills the bacteria. But what if the bacteria has a mutation, an information losing mutation, that makes it so it can no longer absorb that nutrient? Okay, so you'd say, well, it's less fit. We're not really talking about fitness here. It's just because now it can't absorb that nutrient, whereas the other bacteria can. But if that nutrient is really a poison that's going to kill the bacteria, that's actually a benefit to the bacteria in that environment. And since it can't absorb that nutrient, it doesn't get killed by the bacteria. In other words, it can no longer absorb, the bacteria is no longer killed by the antibiotic. In other words, since it can no longer absorb that antibiotic that's disguised as a nutrient, it survives. So it's the antibiotic resistant strain of bacteria, even though it lost genetic information to do that. Okay, so that's a lot of words. Does that make sense? It was the opposite of evolution. It lost information. It lost the ability to absorb this fake nutrient, this that was really a poison. But when someone takes that antibiotic, it'll kill the other bacteria, but it won't kill that one. And so so now there's this antibiotic resistant strain of bacteria that developed through the opposite of evolution, in other words, through a loss of genetic information. Okay, so we got a couple more examples, but is that kind of making a little bit of sense to maybe anybody? Okay, good. All right, excellent. Okay, so we'll keep going. Here's one. This is actually a real obvious one. And the only reason I mention this is there are biology textbooks in the United States where in the teacher's edition, it will say, well, if you have a student that doesn't want to believe in evolution, just tell them to go down to the pet store, okay, and tell them if they see a new breed of dog or a new breed of cat, that's change, and this is where the deception comes in, okay, so that new breed of dog or new breed of cat is change. Evolution is just change, so therefore they're seeing evolution with their own eyes. Okay, well, evolution isn't change. Evolution requires new genetic information to be created. And so that's it's a deception. I don't know how else to describe it. And so when you look at how we develop a new breed of dog or a new breed of cat or a new breed of cattle or a new strain of corn, or it's always been just by eliminating the genetic information we don't want. Okay, and so now people say, oh, but now I can apply all this technology and I can change genes using CRISPR or something. But that's again a lot of intelligence, a lot of but when we look at just traditionally how you develop a new breed of dog or cat or anything, it's you get rid of the information you don't want. So for example, this is a lot of people would say the pair of dogs that came off of the ark probably looked a lot like a wolf. We don't really know what they look like, but they say just this kind of mix of genetic information. Say you want to develop a poodle. Okay, so to develop the poodle, you get rid of all the genetic information that's not poodle. In other words, it's not you have to, any information for making a big dog you get rid of. Maybe long fur you get rid of. And so that's how you end up with a poodle. It's just completely the opposite of evolution. In other words, you're just removing genetic information that you don't want to turn a dog like that into a dog that looks like a poodle. Now, many observations can be made. One of them, I think poodles have something like 46 genetic defects. Okay, and the reason is the genetic defect is because there's been information removed that's actually necessary for the dog to be healthy. Even purebred German Shepherds have a genetic defect. They're considered a really strong dog, but they have, I think it's hip dysplasia they get after a certain age. So again, but that's because we developed those breeds by removing genetic information. There was a wheat blight in Africa a few years ago because we'd removed the genetic information to make the husk on the wheat kernel thicker. We removed that to make it easier to process the wheat into bread, which makes sense. You want it to be easier to process the wheat into food, but in doing that, it made it susceptible to this wheat blight, and so that's why they had. So whenever someone says, "Well, what about new breeds of dogs and cats?" It's the opposite of evolution. Even though sometimes it's spun as well, it's changed. Because it's changed as evolution. That's again just a it's just again it's the opposite of evolution. And then finally, I'll give just an example that we can think about. This as an analogy, and then again we'll have another break just for questions, because this is an important point, because this is the one a lot of people get stuck on. They confuse natural selection with evolution, and the two really aren't related. Natural selection always operates on existing genetic information. evolution would require new genetic information to be created. So they're really, but a lot of times that's where you'll get stuck if you're talking to someone is they'll be talking about natural selection, which we all agree works. You know, we agree the peppered moths, that makes sense. The bacteria makes sense. And so somehow communicating that, okay, yeah, we both agree, we all agree on natural selection, but that's not evolution. That's a hard one to explain. So this is just an analogy, and what this is an analogy for mutations and natural selection. And so what you think about, let's go ahead and, because it's an analogy, you pick a subject that everybody likes. And so usually you use either cars or money, okay? Because everybody likes cars and money. Okay, so this one we're going to start with cars. I'll try to work in a money one later on. Okay, so say you had so you imagine the perfect automobile. It's like the perfect car. And then you want to, since it's such a great car, you want to manufacture the car. So you have to write the manual for making this car. Okay, so you're writing the manual to make the car. But before you make a car, change 100 words in each manual, but they're random words. In other words, you've got this perfect manual for writing the perfect car, for making the perfect car, but before you make any cars, just kind of close your eyes and change 100 words. Now it's random words changed in each manual. So in other words, each manual is going to have a different set of 100 words changed. So that's your random mutations, and that's how random mutations work. Now, you want to have enough cars to also do natural selection, because we're talking about mutations and natural selection. So instead of just making 1,000 cars, make 1,500 cars. Okay, so you've got your 1,000 manuals, each has had 100 words changed in it. In other words, the mutations. You make 1,500 cars. Are the cars going to be perfect? No, not going to be perfect, but they're going to be imperfect in different ways. And so what I mean by that is, okay, so say I changed some words in the manual, and now the rearview mirror is like this big. And I wanted it this big, it's this big. Okay, well, yeah, okay, I can still drive. So I go ahead and I say, okay, I can live with that. I keep those cars with the giant rearview mirror. But suppose I changed the words and that caused the engine to be up on the hood of the car. Okay, I can't live with that. So I get rid of those cars. So what I do is I keep the 1,000 cars that I like the best, and I get rid of the 500 I don't like. Okay, so that's my natural selection. Okay, so I'm just doing mutations and natural selection. Do that again. The manuals that were used to make the 1,000 cars that I kept, I changed another 100 words in all those manuals. Okay, so now each manual's had 200 words changed. I then do the 500, make 1,500 cars. Get rid of the 500 I don't like, keep the 1,000 I do like, do it again. Now I've had 300 words changed, mutations, natural selection. After I've done that 100 times, I've now had 10,000 words changed in each manual. Okay? And it's just mutations and natural selection. So the question is, how long will it take the car to turn into a jet airplane? Right? Yeah, that's not what's happening. And that's exactly analogous to what we see in the genome. We see the genome degrading. Again, when I have time to talk in the summary sessions, there's people saying we're losing 1 to 5% fitness each generation. I mean, a lot of implications of this. So again, but that's what we see happen. We see the genome degrading. We see information being lost from the genome. We don't see information being added to the genome. Okay, so as promised, any questions on that? Any clarification? Because this is probably the area most people get deceived into believing evolution. Yeah?
I was just wondering, what about situations where there is new information presented, like with the discovery of fire, how humans changed like brain size and different organs to be able to consume food with fire? Okay.
So yeah, with the, it'd be two ways of looking at that. So one, there's really good books back there. One is the talks about ancient man, the technology, and it's basically, and then the other one is the apes and humans. So people probably knew about fire from the original creation, and then if we look at the apes and like brain size and stuff, that's we're now finding, this is Christians and non-Christians, like the brain size is basically the same. within you either have skulls that are fully human or skulls that are fully ape, but you don't see the range of, like, say, brain sizes. They're consistent with the range that we see today, cranial capacity. So it's not really a change of brain size. It's not really. Now, as far as the technology, how it's applied, there is something called neuroplasticity that we're finding out. So the earliest example I saw of that is if you have 10 fingers. If I was to have one of my fingers, if I was to say I had an accident, I lost one of my fingers, then the part of my brain that controls my fingers would actually rewire itself. So that entire part of my brain would now be focused on my remaining 9 fingers instead of the 10 fingers. So that's neuroplasticity. And then they're finding, psychologists are even finding, though, that our attitudes, I guess they would say, can actually affect the chemistry in our brain. So like what we do, what we accept, what we focus on. It's a little bit like Philippians 4:8, telling us like what we should focus on. That is actually having a chemical effect on our brain. So like you said, there's a lot. Once we discover something, there's a lot of there are changes in our brains. But as far as I guess you'd have 2 paradigms. The one that we're the one that we're noticing, like I'll give just the example, like lost the slides again. Sorry. But I'll keep talking while Heis is fixing it. I got the easy part. So like what's neat about the ancient civilizations is we'll notice when a civilization shows up, it's usually at its peak, and then it starts to degenerate from there. And so, for example, the Great Pyramid, it was the first pyramid built, but it's also the largest and the most precise. And so that's very consistent with, say, the Tower of Babel, and the people scattered. And where they scattered to, they obviously had good construction knowledge, coming, out of the flood. And so that's where the first pyramid built was the best. And then things degenerated from there. We see that with other civilizations as well. So it's kind of the, I guess, say just the 2 ways to look at it. But you're absolutely right. When we have a new technology, I haven't seen any studies on like the iPhones and the internet, how that's changing our brains. But you do see some changes. So that's a good point. Did that answer the question though, or is that?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Yeah. Sometimes I go off on a tangent and I forget to answer the question, so please let me know if I do that. Yeah.
On the way this morning, as a matter of fact, in the news, they were talking about the difference between natural badgers or natural sparrows and city badgers and city sparrows.
Okay.
And they were saying, oh, see, here you have, we're evolving a new species.
Yeah.
And they can't even mate.
Yeah.
But this is, it's not creating a new badger.
Yeah, it's just, you're actually, a lot of times when we see a new species, it's because of loss of information. And so that's one of the things they're looking at now. So a couple things, like the Bible never says species, it always talks about kinds. So most people think from studying the genetics, and then you can try to actually, a lot of times they'll like breed backwards. So like a lion and a tiger can breed, and that's a liger. So they would say, okay, the lion and the tiger, they came from the same original created kind. That's one way they do that. And so yeah, it's the same thing. The badgers, may get so far removed that they don't breed. They probably could breed, but they just don't. Sparrows could be the same. They are finding Darwin's finches. They thought some of them could no longer breed, but then that's more just again, it's just a loss of information from being separated. But then they're finding out that no, they really can breed. It's just but yeah, it's all coming from the original creator. They used to think 50 years ago, and we'll talk about this. Probably one of the latter points, they used to think that science showed Adam and Eve couldn't be real because they couldn't have had the genetic information, a single man and a single woman, because we all look different. And so as we studied DNA, as we learned about it, we figured out not only could we all have come from a single man, a single woman, by studying mitochondrial DNA, we concluded that we did all come from a single woman. And from studying the Y chromosome, we concluded very consistent with us all coming from a single man. And so that you can go on the internet, that's, again, Christians and non-Christians alike agree we all came from a single woman, consistent we all came from a single man. And then you can even Google like mitochondrial Eve, and it'll show up, again, secular articles. They call them Y chromosome Adam, but these are from people that don't believe in Adam and Eve. And so it's kind of interesting. So what they'll say is, well, yeah, we all came from a single woman, we all came from a single man, but it wasn't 6,000 years ago, it had to be 150,000 years ago. And I think they actually, some are trying to say like, they conclude, well, one's like 118,000 years ago. But then you look at how they studied it, and this is where the true science would be, well, look at the mitochondrial DNA in say a grandmother, or a great-grandmother, a grandmother, the mother and the daughter, and look at the rate that changes are occurring. You get one answer. But another way to do it is, okay, if I assume that, say, apes and humans, both descended from an ape-like creature a really long time ago, you get another rate of change. So to me, the measured one is the more scientific one. That's consistent with the Bible. The one where you're making these assumptions is not consistent. So you're right, it's out there, but to me, because people say, well, if this happened, then everybody's going to believe the Bible. So I don't think that's true. I think people disbelieve the Bible for many reasons, and this can be a stumbling block. It can certainly keep people from considering the Bible. But to me, when everybody pretty much admitted, it looks like we all came from a single woman, and consistent with us all coming from a single man, if that didn't cause everybody to believe the Bible, I don't think anything's ever going to cause everybody to believe the Bible. But good point. Other questions? Yeah.
I was wondering, you were a scientist before you believed, right?
Yeah, I'm still a scientist. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay.
Was it because of science that you started to believe, or because not of science?
So it was because of science, but it was interesting. I was always interested in science and engineering, always interested in this space program. I'll say God was blessing me before I was a Christian, because I got to go to MIT. I got to, I was working towards my PhD, but in the process, I was talking to, I had many people in my life that would point out a lot of what we're talking about today, but because I was outside the church, I would just be, okay, that's nice, and a lot of them were real friendly. They, speak the truth in love. They were very Christian towards me, I'll call it. But I just kind of ignore them. I'd be just like, we'd just be unwind. Instead of watching a football game together, we would just talk about the stuff that they wanted to talk about. And it was like, well, whatever. But then once I was talking to my roommate. Okay, so he was the, has anyone heard of the World Cup? Okay, so you heard of the World Cup. Okay, so in mechanical engineering, there's something called the Thermodynamics Wall of Fame, much bigger than the World Cup. Yeah. It's not as public. But anyway, so this guy, he was so good, he was like the top student. I was at University of Florida at that time. He was a top student in mechanical engineering, had like perfect GPA, except for he got a B+ in music appreciation. I mean, so you can think how his brain's wired, okay? So, and so we're talking, and after about an hour, we're just kind of winding down, and he shows me this paragraph, and his paragraph is written by a philosophy professor. So it's an atheist philosophy professor, and you read this paragraph, and it's basically a profession of faith in evolution. And it says, the universe started with a Big Bang, and then the planets formed, and then life made it. So, life, they'll say appeared, 3.8 billion years ago, and then da. So I read the paragraph, and I'm like, well, yeah, we all know that's true, because I'm still on that side of things, and but the philosophy professor was saying no one should be allowed to get a technical degree unless they're willing to sign this paragraph. In other words, he's saying unless someone is willing to a profession of faith in evolution, they should not be allowed to get an engineering or a science degree. And literally my first impression was just like, well, yeah, I know we have these fun conversations, but of course everybody's going to sign this because we all know it's true, because that's what you keep getting. Well, then it dawned on me, wait, my roommate, who's perfect GPA, Thermodynamics Wall of Fame, he wouldn't sign it. So then you start thinking, okay, wait a second, now this philosophy professor is going to keep my brilliant roommate from getting a technical degree because my brilliant roommate is not an atheist. Okay, so then that just kind of opens the floodgates. So then you start saying, okay, he says something, how did life come about? Could life really make itself? You go over to the biology department. You ask the professors, how did life make itself? They get mad at you. Okay, now as an engineer, you're like, wait a second, I can ask some really dumb questions in engineering and they'll answer it. They don't get mad at me, they don't get emotional on me. So then you really start thinking like, wait a second, and then pretty soon it dawns on you, hey, this is just it's a religious, as the title of the talk says, it's a worldview discussion. And so then if you start really looking at true science, objectively, it all comes down on the side of the Bible. I mean, and I'll literally say all of it, but it took a while to do that. So I'll say it was the science, but it was the scientific discussions that kind of set the stage. But it was literally him showing me that paragraph. They actually got me to objectively consider things. And so the only reason I say that is, we'll go through this fun discussion. Keep the goal in mind. The goal is to really help someone be able to spend eternity with God. It's not winning the argument, because you will win the argument. If it becomes a technical argument, I mean, if the person is willing to get into the details, you'll win. I mean, because totally consistent with the Bible. If they'll probably get mad at you before then and leave. But it's just, but even if you win the technical argument, it doesn't matter. That doesn't do that person any good at all in eternity if they die just knowing evolution doesn't work. And you have a lot of famous examples of that. The person realizes, hey, evolution doesn't work, but no sign at all they ever put their faith in God. You'll have people saying, Fred Hoyle, he named the Big Bang, very famous British astronomer. He has some great quotes of just how evolution can't work, but he didn't want to put his faith in God. So he was probably the one that publicized the idea that aliens put us here on Earth more than anybody. So he doesn't want to believe in God. He knows evolution can't work technically. So he does this, aliens put us here. And then, but you're like, okay, smart guy, Sir Frederick Hoyle, he's knighted. What's the obvious question he missed? I don't think he missed it. He had to know, okay, well then where did the aliens come from? I mean, he had to think that, but he just kind of ignored it. And you could say, well, maybe the smarter aliens made the aliens that made us. Well, then where the smarter aliens come from? Well, those were the really smart aliens. And so it just doesn't, he didn't really answer the fundamental question. But that'd be a case of, to me, that's probably the more public example of someone that realized from science that evolution can't work, but unfortunately never put his faith in God. Again, did that sort of answer the question?
Thanks.
Okay, sure, right? Yeah. And I promise that I am every now and then able to give like a 3-word answer. I usually don't. So don't be shy about asking. Okay, all right, well let's keep going here for just a little bit longer and then we'll take the break. Oops. Okay, so the last one we'll talk about before the break is just the idea on the Big Bang. And this is, you mentioned earlier how it doesn't qualify as a scientific theory. This is just some examples why. So it violates the falsification principle. And I'll move that down. No. I'll just X out of that one. Yeah. Okay. So anyway, but I'll give a little bit of an explanation what I mean by that. So this is this was a quote from one of our former NASA administrators, Mike Griffin. Really, I want to emphasize too, none of this, please don't, none of this is personal against anybody. And I really mean that, but if nothing else, I used to be an atheist, so I can't really, oh man, how can you guys, because I used to do it. So, but this was a quote he made. It says, what is the value of discovering that literally 95% of the universe consists of dark energy or dark matter, terms for things that we as yet know nothing about, but they make up 95% of our universe. Now, in his defense, he's the administrator of NASA, so people are always asking him, well, why are you spending money in space? We got all these problems on Earth. And so the first thing he always mentions is, or most administrators mention, well, we actually don't spend any money at all in space. That money is all spent on Earth to put things in space. Okay, so that's kind of true. Because you get a lot of technology, a lot of fun things developed, and so. But when he made this quote, it was at a dinner speech, and this was his hey, we don't know anything about the universe, so that's why it's important to explore. And I actually totally agree with that. It's important to, if we don't know much about something, it's really important to study it. And so, but I emailed him, and I didn't think he'd get a response. Because again, I'm here in NASA and he's here in NASA, and so I'm working late one night, and that's probably why I bothered with the email, because I'm like, okay, whatever, we'll give it a try. Sent him the email at midnight, And literally by 12:30 in the morning, he'd responded. Okay, and the email is basically, okay, if it's 95% of the universe that we don't know anything about, then how do we know for sure that makes up 95% of the universe? So in other words, it's talking about dark energy, dark matter. We know nothing about them, but we know they make up 95% of the universe. So he responded, it was a totally correct response, he says, well, 95% of the universe has to be dark matter and dark energy for the Big Bang Theory to work. Okay, and so then of course it goes, well, what if the Big Bang Theory is not true? And then, but he stayed really cordial, really respectful the whole time. But it came down to, well, he was gonna, he didn't want to give up on the Big Bang Theory yet. So it wasn't, again, it wasn't a fight. You could have a very objective scientific discussion. But this is, you start to dig into it more, and I obviously wasn't the first person to notice this, because this was it's called the Open Letter to the Scientific Community, still out on the internet. It's about 20 years ago now. But this was signed by, I think it was several hundred, it might have gotten all the way up to 500. These are basically professors, astronomers, postdocs, national lab employees. It says, the Big Bang today relies on a growing number of hypothetical entities, things that we have never observed. Inflation, dark matter, and dark energy are the most prominent examples. Without them, there would be a fatal contradiction between the observations made by astronomers and the predictions of the Big Bang Theory. Okay, so think about that, fatal contradiction. So if we don't make these things up, we've never observed them, if we don't make them up, it's not just like, oh, the theory's not quite as good. I mean, it is a fatal contradiction. It totally destroys the theory. Says, in no other field of physics would this continual recourse to new hypothetical objects be accepted as a way of bridging the gap between theory and observation. It would at the least raise serious questions about the validity of the underlying theory. Okay, so then it goes on, and again, these are all non-Christians. These are just secular scientists, astronomers, professors. It goes on and says, what is more, the Big Bang Theory can boast of no quantitative predictions that have subsequently been validated by observation. The successes claimed by the theory supporters consist of its ability to retrospectively fit observations with a steadily increasing array of adjustable parameters, just as the old Earth-centered cosmology of Ptolemy needed layer upon layer of epicycles. Okay, so that last sentence, that's kind of, I'll call it dense, right? You're like, what are they talking about? Okay, but to an astronomer, that is like the ultimate insult. Because in a polite way, okay? So what Ptolemy had proposed, he's a famous Greek philosopher. So a lot of what we see today, like, well, who's gonna contradict, who's gonna disagree with this famous Greek philosopher? But what he had proposed is that everything in the solar system revolves around the Earth. Okay, so he's saying everything in the solar system revolves around. We start making observations. You look at, say, retrograde motion of Jupiter and Saturn. I mean, all kinds of observations you can make to say, okay, even then, that no, it doesn't look like everything's revolving around the Earth. It looks like things are revolving around the sun. And so, but rather than saying, okay, it looks like everything's revolving around the sun, they started to add what they called epicycles. So they were like, no, we know everything revolves around the Earth. And so, but if we do this and this and this and this and this, then we can make it work. Everything's actually revolving around the Earth. It just looks like it's not revolving around the Earth. And then what they're saying is that's the same thing we're doing with the Big Bang now, because what we're doing is, rather than saying, hey, the Big Bang doesn't work, we're having to make up 95% of the universe, actually up to 96% of the universe now. We just keep adding these adjustable parameters, which are just like these epicycles that have been added. And so when someone's, when you say it's not really a scientific theory, that's what it means. It's not falsifiable, because no matter what the observations are, we just make changes to that theory. So I'll give right before the break, a lot of times people complain that there's not enough math in the presentation, and so I'll give you a math problem, but don't want you to do algebra. Okay, so if x plus y is 100, what does x equal? Can't do algebra.
So one more time.
If x plus y equals 100, what does x equal? But you can't do algebra. Yeah, give me a number.
25.
25, he is absolutely right.
Yeah.
X is 25, y is 75, the answer is 100.
Yeah.
Anybody else want to try it?
Could be
13.
13, he is absolutely right. X is 13, y is 87. Now he's right twice, so yeah, 0, you're right. X is 0, y is 100. So no matter what number you give me for x, if you let me have y, I can make the answer equal 100. Okay? And so if we do the analogy, it'd be like if x is what we actually observe. So we have every way we can think of to observe the universe. X is what we actually observe. And then I have these adjustable parameters, like they're talking about in this theory, where, you know, this letter, you know, where you have dark matter, dark energy, inflation. They have like dark flow, dark light. If I have all those, that could be my Y. So it doesn't matter what my observations are, I can make up these adjustable parameters to have them equal anything they want to. Now, you notice I said 100. Well, what if we come back next year and sorry guys, the answer is really 200. He's still right. It's amazing because now, yeah, X is 25, Y is 175. You know, X is 13, Y is 187. So you know, it's so that's how the Big Bang is construed. And so when, you know, so you wouldn't want to just go up to someone and say, well, you know, the Big Bang's not even a scientific theory. I mean, you could, but then that's liable to get the person all defensive. What do you mean? It's, you know, but it isn't, because, and we won't have time, these summary sessions, but you look at like the James Webb Space Telescope, all the things we expected it to see were completely different from what we saw, but no big deal. We'll just change this and this and this and this and this. And so that's when it talks about how success is claimed by the theory supporters consists of its ability to retrospectively fit observations with a steadily increasing array of adjustable parameters. That's a very fancy way of just saying, yeah, we thought it was going to do this. It did that instead. So we changed our adjustable parameters, you know, and so that's exactly what they're saying, even though that's a very eloquent way of phrasing it, the way they have this letter. So with that, I think, why don't we go ahead and take a 15-minute break or so, and I'll be here if you have any questions. So please look at the materials on the table, and then we'll start up again in about 15 minutes or so.